Hey everybody, welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey, and this is your co-host, Liam DeBoer in Mexico. What's up, dude?
I'm trying out that immigration plan we were talking about. I'm going to see if I can make some cash on the way up back to Canada, just cross a few borders illegally and see if I can make money on the way home.
Please do. I'll be really disappointed now if you don't do it. Just ship all your stuff home, just see how it goes, take a week off, figure it out.
I'm not far. The trek is within reach. All right, today we are going to be chatting about Canadians launching a Freedom Convoy-style carbon tax with protests rising up across the country, Canadian MPs receiving the world's second highest salary for elected officials after a new raise, Australia officially implementing a digital ID, Transgender Visibility Day on Easter Sunday explained after a bunch of political drama arose there, and J.K. Rowling issues Arrest Me challenge over new hate crime laws in Scotland. However, if before we get into things, you wouldn't mind leaving us a kind review on Spotify or subscribing to our YouTube channel wherever you're watching, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, let's get into it. So, first off, we've got Canadians launch Freedom Convoy-style carbon tax protests across the country. Thousands of Canadians from different parts of the country are gathering in protests resembling the Freedom Convoy along highways, provincial borders, and the offices of Liberal MPs to oppose the federal carbon tax. The tax recently increased to 17 cents per litre of gasoline, 21 cents per litre of diesel, and 15 cents per cubic meter of natural gas. The organizers of these events have expressed their readiness to stay for weeks in an effort to persuade Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to revoke the expensive and unnecessary tax. One organizer, Elliot McDavid, mentioned during the Calgary protest that they plan to camp out indefinitely. The Calgary protest had about 400 attendees on Monday morning, with more joining continuously. And Miranda Courts, an organizer at the Lloydminster protest along the Alberta-Saskatchewan border with around 500 attendees, stated that they are committed to staying for as long as it takes. So, do you think that this will snowball much like the Freedom Convoy or fizzle out?
I think Canada's sort of got a unique opportunity here in that no one really is supporting the carbon tax, or at least they're not protesting in favor of it. They're not saying, hey, everybody stay home, we need to pay this carbon tax. What I mean by that is the Freedom Convoy, in our opinion, was necessary, and we appreciate what those people did, for sure. But a big portion of the country didn't. And they were smeared very, very hard in the media. In fact, some of them are still in court fighting cases. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but anyway, that's their situation. However, this one, at least 70% of Canada is against the carbon tax, right? So there's no one really against this protest, unless obviously you're, Justin Trudeau or a liberal MP right now. So Canada has this opportunity where they can sort of band together and support this protest. Why I think this is significant: it may not overturn the actual carbon tax. In fact, it's very unlikely going to do that. But why this is significant is, do you see what they're doing in France and in Europe with all the tractor protests? And look at all the public support they get. So when anything goes wrong, they rise up and they protest, and they actually affect change. We don't have a system like that in Canada. In fact, the last time we protested at the Freedom Convoy, we know exactly what happened. So this is the opportunity for Canadians to actually get behind people protesting for the carbon tax, and then use this new form of protest, whether it's trucks or tractors or whatever, as a weapon that the citizens can actually use against the government to affect change, because right now we're pretty much helpless. So that, is a silver lining for me, whether this works or not.
Yeah. Do you know what the public support for do you remember how it correlated to the Freedom Convoy, how the public support for vaccine mandates was at the time? Because right now we're seeing that obviously the vast majority of Canadians don't support the carbon tax itself.
Right.
So I'm wondering if that's maybe where a lot of that strife and that kind of societal drama arose from, was them actually supporting, say, the mandates.
It's my opinion that people were in support of government action through COVID.
Yeah.
A lot of people were, because a lot of people were just taking in mainstream media information. The other side of that too is, if you pushed back against it, even if you didn't feel that they were the right thing, if you pushed back, you were ostracized, you were vilified, you were kicked out of this or that, you were canceled on social media. So it was incendiary. Like, you just couldn't even touch it. You know what I mean? So people would just didn't even want to be a part of the conversation whether they supported it or not, right? So, but with this carbon tax, no one's really vocally supporting it. You get the odd liberal barking and saying, "Oh, this is that," and you're getting bigger rebates. But if you look at the math and you look at their own parliamentary budget office report, it's not the truth. An average Canadian family is paying as much as $710 additional per year because of the carbon tax, and that's prior to this recent hike of 23%. So arguably, it could be around $850. I mean, that's speculation, but based on the PBO's report, it's actually got there's some meat on that bone. So no one's really supporting the carbon tax. And that was sort of my point, is everyone's on board with sort of protesting against it because it doesn't do anything but, affect the lives of Canadians that are trying to put food on the table. So it's my opinion that they will get a lot of support. And maybe that this is that. What I'm saying is, because people are using this as their opportunity to protest against, the carbon tax, if Canadians will support this, it's not going to pick up as much volume as the Freedom Convoy, but if Canadians at least support it versus being against it like they were with the Freedom Convoy, then perhaps this will become a more regular occurrence for Canadians, where when things are happening that we don't like, we do protest, and it is effective. That's kind of my point.
Yeah, and I do think even more and more people are coming over from that side. Like, man, I was even one of the people at the beginning of the pandemic that I thought the measures being implemented within the first month or so, that I was like, oh, these are necessary. I was on board. And then I obviously switched pretty early. It was about 2 or 3 months into it that I started seeing the writing on the wall that these things weren't actually going to be going away anytime soon. So I started flipping. But I think even now you're starting to see more and more people get on to this general bandwagon of realizing that these people right now aren't doing these things for our own good. Like even I have people within my family or friend circle or any of this kind of stuff that thought I was maybe a little bit crazy at the start of the pandemic, or that I was, having dangerous ideas or whatever, that are now completely coming around to this idea. And so I think there's something to be said too about these protests. It's like, the protesters, yes, are saying that they're protesting the carbon tax, but I think it speaks to a much larger kind of emotion going on in society right now, which is just, it's funny. It's like that kind of 1776 emotion, the taxation without representation. It's just kind of this idea where it's like, hey, you guys are robbing us blind, but we're not seeing much in return. Actually, our lives, the more that you take from us, our lives just continue to get worse and worse. So I think it's actually a much kind of larger emotional protest there. And I think that's maybe why it might pick up some steam, because I think a lot of people are feeling that way right now.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at how the Liberal government has sort of deteriorated the economy over time, and you could argue that if a Conservative were in power, maybe it would be in a similar place. You could, but the reality is Trudeau's in power. He's the one pushing the buttons. This is where we are. This is the first, and this is widespread. People are very upset across the board. 47% of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. It's not going well. This is the first opportunity, I think, that a lot of people have had to actually voice their displeasure with a lot of what's been happening over the last year or two with the economy. So that's the other thing too, whereas this might come to a head because, whether it's the housing crisis, whether it's immigration, whether it's affordability across a wide spectrum of pretty much everything, you know what I mean? Whether it's inflation, whether it's interest rates, you name it, people are upset because they can't afford the lives they once had, right? So this carbon tax is like a cherry on top, but because it's become a protest, it seems like hopefully it does becomes kind of that outlet that people use to sort of voice their discontent with everything that I just sort of listed and whatever else is on their mind. So if that ends up being the case, yeah, this thing could pick up a lot of momentum, because I was actually really surprised to hear some of these people say, they're like, hey, I'll be here for weeks.
Yeah.
I do not care. I am not going anywhere. I'm like, well, good for you.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I support it. If you can do that, do it for sure. That's it's one way to speak. Before moving on here, I just thought maybe it's a good perspective to share as well, because obviously we can talk about the economic side all day about how this tax is ineffective in actually solving anything. That they don't even measure whether the tax itself is having an effect on the climate. So they're just taking the money and not even trying to figure out if it works. But You broke down in the newsletter the other day about the forestry situation in Canada, and I thought that's a very interesting perspective that is probably worthwhile to hear for some people.
I did do a little math because so I kind of started looking at this, and with this thing coming into place, you had Stephen Guilbeault saying this is the right policy for Canadians. This is what we need, and I just kind of felt like I'm like, well, why do we need this? Why are we not doing the math? Kind of we're going backwards and saying why this isn't working. So I kind of did a bit of a breakdown of it. One of the things I mentioned earlier, which was sort of, they say, hey, it's gonna make Canadians money, but according to the PBO, it's actually gonna lose most Canadians money. Up to $710. Guilbeault also claims that carbon pricing targets big polluters, and if this were the case, I might even agree with the policy, maybe. However, it targets every Canadian. It primarily targets us at home and at the gas pumps. And like I said, these are two areas where you can't really reduce your carbon emissions while maintaining employment to afford these insane taxes. And, living in Canada, you got to keep your heat on or you're going to die. It's pretty simple. But this is one of the big things that I broke down because I'd seen things like this online. But I felt like people were maybe sensationalizing it a little bit. So what I did was I tried to understand, what is the big goal here? They're trying to get to net zero, right? That's what the government tells you. So I was like, okay, let's kind of break this down. So according to Statistics Canada, Canadians produce 548 million metric tons of CO2 each year. So Canada is also home to 320 billion trees. Now, according to One Tree Planted, mature trees absorb 22 kilograms of CO2 annually. So when you convert your metric tons to kilograms, there are 1,000 kilograms per metric ton. So when we do the math there, that means that Canadians produce 548 billion kilograms of CO2 every year. Now, with each tree absorbing 22 kilograms a year, with each tree absorbing 22 kilograms a year and us producing 548 billion kilograms of CO2 every year, when you do the math there, it means we would only need 24.9 billion mature trees to achieve net zero in Canada. Considering we have nearly 13 times that number of trees, it becomes pretty evident that the government's taxation strategy is completely unnecessary because we are well below net zero. So this is really only to advance their agenda, whatever it may be.
And then, too, if you even zoom out from Canada, like data from NASA satellites have shown that over the last 2 decades, the Earth has increased its green leaf area by 5%, equivalent to the size of the entire Amazon rainforest. And the green area has increased by an average of 2.3% per decade before that. So, this is kind of one of those things where it's like, this is nature's counterbalance to the fact that there's more CO2, which is plant food, and then there's more plants to then continue on with taking in that CO2. And I think this whole carbon idea is just insane that you can limit that. Even just the fact that any carbon you emit lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Well, 100 years on the low end, and it can go up. So it's one of those things where the stops that we do right now, we're not even going to see we won't even be able to measure the things that we do right now, the effect that they have 10, 20 years down the line. It's literally another generation we'll have to essentially try to check our work. And I think they're going to find out that we failed. But it's like, we should put a lot more of our effort into, because I do want to see, say, better care of the environment. I would just like to see those efforts put more towards actual, actionable pollution, in the sense of stuff like what happened in East Palestine in the States there, where, a bunch of chemicals get dumped in a river. It's like, those are very, I find, controllable issues. But when it comes to this carbon issue, this whole we're gonna get to net zero, that's where it's just like this. It's an impossible task, and what scares me is when you have the justification that you're trying to save the world, any means are justified. All right, but let's move on here to the second story of the day, which is Canadian MPs receive world's second highest salary for elected officials. So as the cost of living rises for Canadians on April 1st, members of Parliament are set to receive substantial pay raises despite widespread opposition among the public. The salary increase, ranging from $8,500 to $17,000, will bring the annual earnings of MPs to $203,100, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's salary reaching $406,200 per year. So, do you think MP salaries should be tied to their constituents' average income and cost of living? Because this seems pretty insane that while Canadians, they're struggling in ways that they have not for decades, arguably since the 1980s, and then you're seeing these people, become the richest politicians in the world next to America. It just doesn't seem very justified to me.
Well, I mean, so this is sort of a nuanced conversation for me because I feel two ways about it, to be honest with you. In general, I don't feel like politicians make enough money to do the job. So I think that's why we attract subpar talent. I think if you want high quality individuals to come and help run your country, you need to pay them more, because high earners, like $400,000 a year is good, but that's the top dog. These guys are making $200 a year, right? So for an MP, I know a lot of people that are super capable individuals, but they make 5 times that a year. So the incentive structure is not quite there for them. But given the way the system currently works and the people we do have in power, yeah, this is a total mess. I mean, these people, there's absolutely no way they should be able to have these fixed salary increases, given where the economy's at and given where the country's at and given how many people are struggling to put food on the table. At least the Harper government in 08-09, sort of in solidarity, froze their salary raises because of the global financial crisis. And, one could argue that, that really wasn't on Harper. That was more, it was a global crisis, and a lot of that was on the States.
Yeah.
Obviously we did some things wrong. Don't get me wrong there, but where Canada's at, a lot of what we're suffering from right now is a direct result of Trudeau's actions. And, this guy comes in here, makes a total mess of things. And like I said earlier, 47% of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. And we all just had a massive increase in this carbon tax. And then this guy gives, his MPs raises ranging from between $8,500 to $17,000 a year. It is so tone deaf. Like, yeah, it would be great if they tied it to something. I just don't know how you could effectively do that.
One thing that I think about, I believe it was Jocko Willink who said this. Don't quote me on that, but he was saying something along the lines of how he thinks that politicians, it should be much more of a duty-bound profession, almost one of those things that it's like service for your country. It's looked at like militarily, not necessarily a business decision. But I think too, I think maybe you'd know a little bit more about this, but don't a lot of these MPs and stuff have their own businesses and other things on the side that this is a main chunk of what they do? But even I remember Polyev grilling one of the MPs in a question period, this was years ago, about how he was voting against oil drilling projects in Canada while meanwhile having a stake in a foreign oil company.
Yeah, so you some of them do have other gigs on the side. It's not as common as you'd think. Because you can't really have another job per se. You might be on a board for this or that or whatever, and you see that kind of stuff all the time, putting a politician on the board because it works in your favor, or whoever you're trying to manipulate or whatever you're trying to do with public policy. So you see that kind of stuff. But you do get some entrepreneurs that do have businesses that do continue to run them. However, the further up the ladder you climb, the more you have to worry about the conflict of interest. It's not substantial at the low level, but once you get up into the minister level, like, yeah, there's a lot of scrutiny on you for stuff like that, right? Because you would arguably manipulate policy to suit your needs, like Polyev said to this other guy, right? So I mean that does kind of get in the way a little bit. That being said, like, I understand the idea of it being a service, but here's the thing: if you run your government properly, like truly did it well, and there was none of this bullshit, none of this corruption, I think people would enter political service in their 50s, 60s, 70s with a wealth of knowledge and experience. I think if you had a system like that where everyone sort of had that sense of community and responsibility, where the government actually did do positive things for the community and society, that people would be interested in going through that path and then contributing in a way that they thought was beneficial. But the system is so corrupt. It's so bureaucratic. It's so self-serving. A litany of other things I could say about it that are terrible. That's what the system is. And you and I look at this and go, it's actually too big to fall. You look at what Javier Milei is doing in Argentina, and you and I applaud him because we're like, yeah, that's what we need to do. But it's actually so big. I actually don't know how they tear it down and rebuild. And from the outside looking in, if you have half a brain, you know, in your 30s or 40s even, you look at that system, you're going, this is a complete mess. I've got no interest in being a part of this. So then the only incentive, the only way to draw on the right people is to pay them more. It's this weird thing. Like that's your first step is to hire the right talent to fix the system. And then you may be able to get it to a place where people just want to contribute their time because it is actually benefiting society.
As somebody that just ruthlessly hates government in general, I do kind of feel like talking about how you could essentially turn the government into virtuous actors who want to serve their community rather than economic leeches who, get their paycheck at the expense of stealing funds and taxes from citizens. But like, it feels to me a little like talking about how great it would be to have a cuddly bear and have a bear as a pet. And you're like, yeah, it's great, but like, let's realize that in its nature is to maul you. So maybe it's not the best to try to go that route and try to make it happen and just go, hey, those people aren't ever going to, whether it be politicians or governments, this institution or these people aren't ever really going to be acting in the best interest. I do think you get well-motivated individuals that try to go into that apparatus and try to change things, but I think more or less you end up getting forced to play the game, and you have to kind of go against your own principles and morals to be effective in politics. And I think that's kind of where a lot of that issue stems from.
Yeah, I mean, you have to you get swallowed up if you don't play the game. You just get eaten alive. They have all these alliances, and they've got all this, there's seniority and all these other things to sort of break into the system. And that's kind of the other problem too, right? If you get in and you actually want to affect change, you get stifled very quickly, right? And that's why a lot of people are like, oh, you have to create change at the community level, like, oh, the mayors and this and that and blah blah blah. And I agree. I actually agree with a lot of that. I think it's a good place to start.
One thing I was thinking in regards to this as well is, say a lot of the liberals will take the brunt for this, and it's like, oh, these liberal MPs are getting these raises or whatever. But I mean, if it affects all MPs, so even conservative MPs are getting a raise, and I even look at it like from that aspect of, okay, even though it's not their policy that is deteriorating our country right now, they have been ineffective in combating those policies, in being essentially opposition. So in my eyes, they're just as undeserving of that pay raise as the people who are actively putting in those policies.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that if you actually, you know what, there's a lot of little things that they say about government, like, oh, it's, two wings from the same bird, two puppets from the same master, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the idea. And at the end of the day, these people are all in it together in some fashion. They really are. They take care of themselves. Because here's the thing. You look at all these MPs, or you look at the people like that are in power right now, and then you look at the opposition. Well, they all get paid. So if the next election they lose, they're like, all right, man, I'm going to go sit on the other side this time. And then I'm still going to argue with you and still make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It doesn't really change their lives. They pretend like it does, but I don't really think they give a shit. I think they're more worried about themselves and their own lives. I think that's really what this boils down to. So you're not going to see anybody push back against that policy, just like you're not going to see anybody push back against that election reform policy where Trudeau is bumping out the election date by a week, because a lot of those people that are going to benefit from receiving their pensions are conservatives, are NDP, are liberals. Yeah. So like it's for all of them, right? It's just right now you and I kind of sit here and shit on Trudeau for it because he's the one implementing it, but they're all in on this kind of stuff together, right? And it is very much like I make the joke that it's the world's largest mafia. It's unfortunate, but it's exactly what it is. They just take our money and they make sure they take care of themselves. It's frustrating. It's very discouraging. But I looked at getting into the political system, and once I kind of got a look under the hood, I was like, this is insane. Like, I don't want anything to do with this. In fact, what I'm going to do is just make myself incredibly wealthy so that I can actually affect change more like across the board. It doesn't matter who's in charge or who's in power. But yeah, anyway.
Something that I even learned over the last couple months in regards to Canadian politics is what's really interesting is the party leader essentially creates the entire party line and essentially spoon feeds the opinions that all other MPs in that party have to follow. It's not as much like America where, say, you've got a I know this is a congressman to a senate, but like, let's say you've got two people on the same side of the political aisle, like a Manchin and a AOC. They're technically part of the same party. They're both Democrats, but they vary widely in their approach to policy and approach to even just how they talk about things. Whereas in Canada, the MPs even sometimes have to run their tweets by the party and the party leader, essentially, to get like okayed to say this thing. And then you look down in the States or something where, I'm not a fan of her. I think she's batshit crazy. But you've got people like Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's not asking anybody to approve her tweets.
No. No, she's a bit wild. But yeah, they definitely play a tighter political game here in Canada. I don't know what that's about. I think these things just become the way they are over time. I think it's such a big integrated thing. It's like this huge ship. You can kind of steer it and hope that it moves in the right direction a little bit. But you can't really do too much. I think it's just kind of where they landed. But yeah, it is interesting. Like, this is sort of one of the reasons I've lost faith in politics is we all know that in across the board, liberals and premiers across Canada, they're all against this carbon tax, right? And they've got the opportunity to sort of push back against it, but because it goes against the party line, no chance. And that's kind of what this boils down to me is like, at the end of the day, these people aren't really representing our interests. It doesn't really matter what side of the fence they're on. It's like you said, it's top down. So they just go, well, what does that guy say? That's the line I got to toe no matter what. I'm going to tell you what you want to hear and you're going to vote me in, but I'm going to do whatever that guy says. And that's the end of it, which is, I guess, one thing I do appreciate a little more about the States versus Canada. I mean, their states have more power than our premiers do at the provincial level. But I mean, fuck, go take a look down there. It's an absolute dumpster fire as well. So, I mean.
Yeah, unfortunately. All right, moving across the pond here, we've got Australia officially implementing a digital ID. So, after the government rushed legislation through the Senate with no opportunity for debate, no second reading, and no discussions on its amendment, Australia is officially getting a digital ID. The Digital ID Bill 2023 lays the groundwork for extending the Australian government's digital ID system to encompass state and territory government services as well as private sector interactions, as stated in a press release by Australian Finance Minister Katie Gallagher. Australian Senator Matt Canavan emphasizes the need for amendments to the Privacy Act to safeguard citizens' data privacy, especially in the context of increasing surveillance measures like facial recognition technology and surveillance cameras, which he warns could lead to a quote-unquote surveillance state. Some fear that a digital ID could pave the way for a social credit scoring system, adding another layer of concern regarding individual freedoms and privacy rights. So are we going to see digital IDs rolled out across the Western world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the push for national IDs and even a global digital ID is well underway. And you're seeing it a lot in the West. I think it's inevitable. I really do, which is wild. I mean, people lean into the convenience of it, but the widespread adoption is going to have significant implications for us, and it's going to be very, very bad. I mean, one of the things we saw, obviously, with these passports was they use them for vaccines through COVID, right? So while they kind of introduced them as, voluntary, they were already used coercively to influence vaccination, right? If you didn't get your vaccine, you couldn't go to work, you couldn't travel, you could do this, blah, blah, blah. So it's like we have already got these systems in place, and we've seen what they will do with them when they want to. And the thing is, they keep pretending it's like, well, I've got this big stick, but I'm not going to use it. Don't worry. And it's like, well, why do you need it then? It's pretty basic. Beyond that, the digital IDs also, in my opinion, really do pave a way for sort of this social credit score. People think it's like, oh no, that's only happening in China. But yeah, but they started with the digital ID. This is where it starts. Yeah. This is exactly what it is. And we saw what they did with the vaccination stuff. So we're kind of like, hey man, put two and two together here. This is moving in the wrong direction very quickly. One more thing you can throw on top, Trudeau already froze people's bank accounts. Like, look, this is definitely moving in the wrong direction. And, one of the other things that gets raised too is that they may be using these to leverage carbon impact scores on people. You know what I mean? And again, this just becomes a middle class, poor person tax because rich people can just pay for it. They don't really care. This isn't going to affect them. But if you don't have enough carbon credits, can you travel? Can you go here? Can you go there? And people bitch about these 15-minute cities like they're not going to be a thing. But first of all, we already know they're doing it. Second of all, I think it's in Ireland or it's somewhere in the UK, Well, right now, and this is the Western way of doing this, right? So people are like, oh, it's not going to be like China. It's like, okay, you're right. They're going to do it in a way that you think you've got more freedom, but you don't. You can only enter and leave the city so many times a year. And when you breach that number, you have to start paying a tax to the government. This is the exact same thing. This is like the centerpiece of this nightmare. Digital IDs are honestly the beginning of the end of a lot of sovereignty for people, and I just don't think people realize how bad this is yet.
Yeah, the mechanisms for control that it will allow these politicians is actually insane. Like this is, I haven't dove too deep into the actual framework itself, but I can imagine that this would at least be able to happen. I'm not saying it's exactly going to happen or as soon as they roll it out, this is going to be put in place, but it at least, I've used the term turnkey totalitarianism before, where it's like those mechanisms are in place where at least even if they're not being used, all it has to be is almost a switch flicked, and all of a sudden we are in a completely totalitarian state resembling something like China's. And if you consider that throughout the last couple years, they had to rely on people complying with their policies and essentially enforcing them on one another, right? So, for instance, okay, we're not going to allow unvaccinated people to go to restaurants. Well, you have to rely on individual restaurants enacting that policy.
Which we did not.
Good on you. So let's just imagine that 5-10 years down the road, we get another pandemic like all these assholes, try to say is coming and is inevitable. And then, you don't get vaccinated. And because your digital ID is linked with your banking information, with your government services, the government in your digital ID, it just says, this person is not vaccinated, and then that triggers something in the bank's system where if you don't have this other aspect within your digital ID, then all of your banking options and your payment options are just no longer going to be accepted or be able to have transactions at certain types of businesses. So you don't even have to rely on those businesses checking your vaccination status as you come in, but rather you just have no ability to even pay them for their services.
Yeah, so that's a good way of putting, like, sort of a good example of explaining where this is going with centralized power. So in China, if you jaywalk and they catch you on a camera, they just take money out of your bank account.
Yeah.
It just costs you money to walk across the road.
And then they also show your face in the public square and essentially deem you a bad citizen to everyone in the public.
They do it online as well. They have a blacklist and a red list.
Yeah.
So it's pretty wild, man. Like this, and this is where this stuff goes. And like you said, that's one example of integration. But they can integrate everything. They could literally be like, hey, you can't buy that much meat. You've hit your quota. Okay, so you don't have not only, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you just can't purchase it. You know what I mean? Yeah. Or like you said, you look through the list of things, and what'll happen is businesses will be forced to interface with this, or because they have to pay taxes, they need business licenses, they need all these things. So if they choose not to interface with this, they probably won't be able to operate. So before it had to be 1-to-1. You had to comply or not, and we didn't comply. We were like, no, I'm not checking people's vaccination records. That is absolutely mental. I'm not doing it, and we got supported for it, which is great. That's 1-to-1 because they couldn't really enforce that, but at this level, with everything integrated and centralized, it doesn't become a choice anymore. People are well, I'm not going to support your restaurant because of X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, I don't have a choice. I can't be open unless I interface with this system, which means they can control everything. This could be wild over the next 10 years.
For sure. And, I am just absolutely fascinated with totalitarian societies of the past, the Soviet Union, Chinese Communist Party, and so on. And something that I've noticed with them is both of them implemented these like internal passport systems, these kind of all-encompassing things that then allowed them to create the quote-unquote social credit score. Obviously, it was a little bit harder to do back then because they don't have the available technology and it's so pervasive now. But So they both implemented these systems, and then they were distinct from international passports, but they were required for domestic travel and relocation within the country. So let's say you did something that the party deemed that they didn't like, well, then they could make your passport now invalid to travel to certain regions. And what would end up happening too is during the famines in the Chinese Communist Revolution, they had a massive problem. It's so fucked because they would steal, the government would procure all of the food and production from the farmers, and then they were going to redistribute it themselves. That's the command economy economic model of a communist nation, right? But what would end up happening is that food would get taken out of the countryside. They had priority to the urban workers because they wanted industrialization, and then the farmers ended up starving, and all the food, even despite the fact that they were producing it, all of the food was in the cities. So what they ended up having was like mass migrations of rural people going into the cities to try to find food, and then they would use these passport systems to make sure it's like no, you're a rural peasant, you need to go back out there. And then they were able to stop this mobilization. What's crazy is what ends up actually happening there is, as you get more farmers going to the cities and stuff to try to find food, you have less people making food, and it just starts this whole like steamroll system. Obviously this is a bit off of the whole digital ID system, but like these passport systems can be used in order to control people when they start pushing back against the inevitable outcome of your terrible policies.
Yeah, I mean, another good example of this in China was there were journalists that were writing things that were not positive about the government. They weren't terrible, like they didn't need to be, they weren't thrown in jail for it, but they were just sharing an opposing viewpoint. So they weren't allowed to use transit anymore. And you're just kind of like, whoa, like, you know, that's how controlled their system was, where, you know, you've got like, okay, well, this journalist works for this company, they wrote this. They just press buttons over here and this guy can't get on the bus anymore. Yep. People say that sounds wild, but it's happened. And they're like, well, it happened over there, but they're doing the same things, guys. They're doing the same things. They dress it up a little differently like they did over in the UK, but they're doing the same stuff. And now that you've got a Western nation that is implementing this digital ID, and like you said, it was no second reading, no debate, nothing, just jammed it through because they knew everybody would fight it. Now you've got a test case. Now it's happening. Now it's easier to continue implementing across the across the Western world.
When people talk about these things, they'll push back and go, well, do you really need to try to take it to this extreme, talking about China? Like, we're obviously not China, we're so far away from China. And you're like, yes, we are not in the same position of tyranny as the citizens of China. You are right, but what I'm realizing is that 2 decades ago, we maybe, if you looked at our authoritarian tendencies mirroring somebody like China, it was maybe like 1% to 2% of the same kind of policies and the same kind of things being implemented. And then it just in a single decade, I'm looking at it and going, wait, we're now resembling them to like 20%. Yeah, we're not nearly as far as they are, but like there is a clear trend and we are accelerating at a fast rate to model these countries.
I agree. And I think the biggest thing is, not for nothing, they control society better. Those systems, that is easier to control the people. It is easier to centralize power for whoever wants it and whatever their goals are. That is a better way of doing it. And what they're saying is like, oh, we like those tools that worked for you. Okay, we'll just dress it up a little differently. We'll explain it so it feels like it's still a democracy, but we're going to implement these same things. But like you said, look, we're on the path. You and I are just jumping ahead. So you get on the subway train, you go from station to station to station. You and I are just 10 stations ahead. We're just watching and we're going, I know where you guys are going. I've been there. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That's kind of the way you and I are sort of looking at this. But I think it's important for people like us to do this stuff. I think it is important for us to identify these trends and to explain it to people because, like, let's be realistic. Until we started doing this, before the pandemic, like I wasn't spending as much time in this political space. Now I do it pretty much full time. It's a lot of work and you have to cut through a lot of crap and you actually have to do a reasonable amount of investigative journalism to really understand what's going on. So people like us sort of explaining it to people, yeah, we don't always get everything 100% right. But when we start seeing these trends and we're identifying all these patterns, explaining it to people is important so they can say, hey, we do need to sort of push back. We do need to stand up. We do need to do something about it. And maybe they don't do it now. Maybe they do it when we're 30% the same as China or 40% the same as China. But if they don't identify, or if they're not aware that we are moving in that direction, they won't have the wherewithal to stand up or push back whenever they finally hit their threshold. So, it may seem, I don't know, people might say it may seem a little hyperbolic or maybe a little over the top, but I don't think it is, man. I think you and I are just, concerned about where this country is going, and I think we've seen enough to prove that they are willing to do it. They're willing to go there. So
for sure. And even like the very concept of logic in rationale is that if X equals Y and X equals Z, then Y also has to equal Z. So like if to input this into this equation, it's like if Chinese digital ID systems are used to enact tyranny and Canadians' ID system mirrors that of China's, then it also by logic would stand that Canadians' ID system would be just as tyrannous as China's.
Yes, exactly. I totally agree with you. And like I said, like they may twist and turn and they may rebrand it in a different way, but we've already seen them willing to do the things that are tyrannical. You've already seen it, and you saw it through the pandemic. And I think that was just a test in a way, a test to see how compliant people were. And I think they liked what they saw. So here we are.
All right, moving on here to Transgender Visibility Day on Easter Sunday Explained. So President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump's camps have clashed over Biden's proclamation of March 31st as Transgender Day of Visibility, coinciding with Easter Sunday. Biden's declaration to honor transgender Americans was met with criticism from Trump's campaign and Republican leaders, who labeled it as disrespectful to Christians and an assault on the Christian faith. The White House defended Biden's proclamation, emphasizing his commitment to unity and upholding the dignity of all Americans, while also dismissing claims of religious symbols being banned as misleading. Now, you did a good breakdown of the misframing of the situation in order to score political points, so I thought I would let you run with that there.
Yeah, so I at first when I saw this, I was like, oh, that's wild. I'm like, why would he do that? That's so divisive. And I said, you're seeing this a lot in politics these days. So my initial thought was, hey, they keep giving all the Republicans and conservatives trouble for being so divisive, but look at this. This is wild. So I dug a little deeper. Unfortunately, if you're a Republican or a conservative, the Republican media sort of spun this. Biden didn't really make a declaration. I think he was maybe celebrating Transgender Visibility Day on Easter Sunday because it was March 31st. So Transgender Visibility Day has fallen on March 31st for 15 years when it started back in 2009. So this isn't really a political thing. It really isn't, and it shouldn't be. And I if anything, Easter's the day that kind of moves around,
Yeah.
Transgender Visibility Day being put on March 31st, I really don't think they were considering, oh, well, Easter Sunday might fall on that day once every 10 or 12 years or whatever it may be, right? So, I do think it's important to sort of identify that, hey, this is just sort of an issue that was made a lot more inflammatory unnecessarily in the political community. And, I know that everything political these days bleeds over into our community, right? That being said, you did share a list with me that was pretty surprising. And what it sort of highlighted were the national days allocated for the LGBTQ plus community. And I'm not going to go through all of them. There are about 25 to 30 of them, 30 days in a year. But what I kind of found amazing, that it was, 25 to 30 different holidays for the community, was that there were 3 separate entire months. So June, the entire month, is Pride Month. The entire month of October is LGBT History Month. And the entire month of November, back-to-back months, is Trans Awareness Month. And it kind of made me feel like maybe there was a little over-representation there. It doesn't really fit with the volume of LGBTQ community members. I just thought it was a bit wild. I do think they've gotten a little carried away with how far that schedule's gone.
I thought it was funny too how many of these days are just, it's the same thing being celebrated multiple times. Like on April 13th, you've got International Day of Pink, which is a day of opposing homophobia. And then May 17th, you've got International Day Against Homo, Bi, and Transphobia. You're like, okay, come on. Like, do we really need to, this is the exact same thing, multiple times now? It's definitely getting carried away. And something I think I sent a study to you a while back as well, showing how of the people who identified as transgender, 57% of them also had clinical narcissism. And if you look at what it means to be a narcissist, it means that you want unearned social status. It's that you believe you have a right to status just for simply existing. And then you look at this and you go, what is this other than that? If it's not just a massive list of every day or these months, you need to pay all of this attention to me simply because of my sexuality or gender identity or whatever you want to call it. It's like, I look at that and go like, we're celebrating narcissism.
Yeah, I also think it may be the liberal government or democratic government pushing an agenda. I think it is one of their ways of like subversion, of sort of like getting in there and being like, hey, it's another LGBTQ plus celebration. And they kind of come out of nowhere, but they're constant. They're all the time. You're always celebrating this. I think it's a way to sort of under the rug implement your agenda a little bit, you know? I mean, people may push back and think that's not really the case, but based on the volume of days and the number of months, in comparison to other things, I think it's a reasonable argument.
Well, you know, this leads us into the next topic of kind of, you know, using this social movement as a way to implement a political agenda where you go, okay, we're going to create this sacred cow group, these people that are above criticism. You're not allowed to push back. You're not allowed to question because they're so oppressed and we need to accommodate them at all costs. And so you create that narrative first by overemphasizing and putting more importance on this LGBTQ stuff than is necessary because of how few there really are. And then what you can do on the back end is then you go, okay, well, seeing as these people they face such threats and they're in constant danger and they're under oppression, we need to put in censorship laws in order to protect this group. And then this leads into, you know, J.K. Rowling now issuing arrest me challenges over the new hate crime laws. So J.K. Rowling has publicly challenged Scotland's new hate crime law, criticizing its potential impact on freedom of speech and belief. She posted on social media referring to transgender women as men and highlighting criminal cases involving them. Rowling argued that accurately describing biological sex should not be deemed criminal and expressed her readiness to be arrested if her posts violated the new law. The law aims to address hate crimes related to various characteristics but does not protect women as a group. Rowling criticized the prioritization of transgender women or transgender issues over women's rights and expressed concerns about the limitations on freedom of speech and belief. Scotland's First Minister Humza Yousaf defended the law as addressing a quote-unquote rising tide of hatred, emphasizing that only behavior intended to stir up hatred is penalized. So do you think the Scottish government is bold enough to actually try and arrest somebody like J.K. Rowling, or do you think they know that it will just make a martyr out of her?
Humza Yousaf is a nutbag. This guy's an absolute tyrannical leader. He should not be in power. He's wild. He's implementing this agenda with impunity. I would not be surprised at all if she got arrested. You know, there's also like the court of public opinion, like you and I like to discuss once in a while. She is hated by the LGBTQ community. So yeah, I mean, I would not be surprised, but it's important that people like her stand up and push back, because she's been on the forefront of this argument the whole time, because what they're doing is they're basically they're throwing away women's rights for trans rights, right? And that's kind of where she's at. She's like, well, women should be a protected group, but they're not anymore against this trans community. So I appreciate that she's pushing back, you know, and I also think it's important that she's pushing back against this censorship stuff. Because again, once this stuff is implemented, I just don't know the lengths that they're going to be able to go to right now. But all I know is that I'm very, very concerned about it. Like, I had a conversation on the Easter weekend. I was at a family dinner. Great family dinner conversation, by the way. There was 20 of us there. And we were talking about Bill C-63. And, you know, my general statement, or my quick point was, you know, as someone who shares opposing views against the government, and says things that are, I do my best to base everything in logic, and I try to be decent, and I don't ever try to be hateful, but based on this new hate speech stuff, I'm like, I'm going to have a lawyer on retainer immediately, because if I can be thrown in jail or arrested or have an ankle bracelet or whatever, because someone anonymously believes that I might create a speech hate crime sometime in the future, if that's the new metric to get me arrested, I'm fucked. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's good for her for pushing back, because honestly, the things she's said, if these rules come into place, these laws, these policies are put in place, she will also be in a lot of trouble almost immediately. And it's insane, because her point is very good. You know, you're making it illegal to speak the truth. Logic, science, truth. You're making it illegal. That is wild. So good. I'm happy she's pushing back.
I just outright refute this whole narrative. Now, you have a right to dress however you want in public. You have a right to say, this is my name, or you can think you're a woman. I don't care, but you don't get to make me think that as well. And then, so just that very concept in and of itself is deemed hatred by these people. So yeah, to your point, like, I'm fucked too. Like, we're both, we're gonna be
equally, we'll go in and we'll split on the lawyer together, because we're both in a lot of trouble.
We're both gonna be on the first train into Gayschwitz.
100%, dude.
But it goes back to the point about the journalism stuff. To understand how dangerous these things really are, you do have to go deep down the rabbit hole to look at the potential consequences. Because yeah, this whole idea that it's like, oh well, what does it harm? It's just a word. It's just a word. We change language all the time. And it's like, no, we change language when it's useful to change language, and when somebody comes up with words or with concepts or phrases or in a way that makes sense, and we want to take on almost like a marketplace of language. This is an imposition of language. This is forcing people to talk a certain way. You're not just coming up with a new helpful way for people to communicate. You are rather shoving it down their throats the way that you want them to.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally it's oppression on the other foot. That's the reality here. And I think a lot of times people they forget or don't really realize what these policies can do. So right now they go, well, it's a hate crime bill because you can't say the things I don't want you to say, right? And now we kind of go, okay, well, who's the filter for this? Who gets to go to the Human Rights Tribunal and say that Jonathan or Liam, well, they are going to commit a hate crime of hate speech one day, and you need to arrest them. And they go, you know what? Yes, they will. So what's the current filter in place? It's a liberal filter. That's what it is. What happens when it's a Republican or a conservative filter? People don't want to think about that. They go, well, what? So, you know, at first what's going to happen is they're just going to repeal things. You know, conservatives are going to go, this is insane. We got to get rid of this. But what do you do if you've got a tyrannical leader who's conservative? What does that do to, for example, the LGBTQ community? What happens to them? It's basically, it's considered, they're like a terrorist organization in Russia. I'm not even kidding.
Yeah.
So, like, you see how this can go both ways. And I just think the people implementing the policy are doing this from a self-serving perspective, thinking this is going to be good for me because I can say what I want and I'm in control. And like you said, there's that narcissism that comes along with it. But once this policy is in place, it's going to be very harmful for us right away. But it could be very harmful it will be very harmful for everybody over time. And that's why we need to stop it. That's why it's got to just cut it right off of the neck.
Yeah, one of my favorite memes of all time is it's a like transgender blue-haired person being put up against a wall by a communist, and she's going, but wait, when do we get the free health care? And it's like the guy's about to shoot her in the back of the head, and it's like, yeah, like the powers that you are giving the government in order to quote unquote protect you are the exact things that are going to be used in order to put you in danger. This idea of outsourcing all safety to the government is actually the most dangerous concept.
Wildly dangerous.
Anything else you want to add today, brother, before we get out of here?
No, that's it. That's all.
All right. Well, before we do, don't forget to head over to our website to sign up for our newsletter, blendrnews.com. That's BLENDR news.com. And we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.